Hey everyone, and welcome to the last episode in my video series presented and funded by KupoCon, where I've been exploring the Final Fantasy VII compilation lore and Easter eggs that appear in Remake. I'm MJ Gallagher, author of The Nibelheim Incident, an award-winning novel and audiobook also produced by KupoCon, as well as my latest release, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII. The purpose of this series has been to discuss a lot of the detail hidden within Remake, and to provide a broader understanding for new and veteran fans alike. In the previous episode, I covered the climax to Chapter 17, which takes place in the Presidential Office of Shinra Headquarters. This included the death of President Shinra, the Sephiroth clones escaping with the Genova specimen, the confrontation with Rufus, and much more. This time around, I'll be breaking down the final chapter of the game. It's self-titled Destiny's Crossroads. Please be aware, it's a big one. The video will inherently include heavy spoilers for Final Fantasy VII Remake, elements of its DLC, episode intermission, and the compilation of Final Fantasy VII as a whole. Before we begin, if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. But otherwise, let's mosey. Having escaped the Shinra building via, let's say, an elevated side exit, the party drives off along the expressway, aiming to put distance between themselves and HQ. Barrett and Red 13 are in the rear of the Shinra SA-37 hauler, with the latter noting that the Whispers are gathering en masse around the tower. The scene soon switches to the 70th floor executive suite, where we find Rufus, heir to the Shinra Corporation, and Sung, chief of the Turks, who has been established in previous videos as loyal to the new president. Rufus can clearly see the Whispers and is surprised to discover that Sung cannot. Many fans are still unsure about the explanation for this. In Chapter 17, and again later in this chapter, Red 13 mentions that the Whispers protect the flow of destiny, and will intervene when someone tries to alter that course. Cloud also suggests in Chapter 4 that the Whispers will only appear to those with whom they have made physical contact, which is based on his experience in Chapter 2, where they materialise after Aerith grabs his arm. Towards the end of Chapter 17, Cloud and Rufus do battle, which covers the physical contact element. But is the new president really capable of altering the course of destiny? Well, given that Rufus funded and influenced the activities of Avalanche during Before Crisis, becomes the leader of the most powerful company in the world during Final Fantasy VII, and is speculated to be the financier behind the World Regenesis organisation in Dirge of Cerberus, I'd say there are few people with a bigger part to play in humanity's fate. In any case, co-director Motomu Toriyama outright confirmed it in the Q&A section of Remake's Material Ultimania Plus. One of the most innovative things about the original Final Fantasy VII was the number of minigames it included, and none of these were more exciting than the highway chase sequence. It makes a glorious return in Remake, and, as with the corkscrew tunnel section of Chapter 4, the player gets to take control of Cloud on a motorbike, specifically the iconic Hardy Daytona. The pursuit begins with a cutscene where the security officers somehow leap over Cloud, in a visual that is reminiscent of the chase sequences of Advent Children, one of which takes place on a very similar expressway. This observation is worth highlighting, because it is the first of many Advent Children references in Chapter 18. Perhaps the most obvious difference between the old game and Remake is quite simply how stunning the updated graphics are. That goes for the vehicles and combat, as well as the background. Something I really love here is how the environment changes with each new phase of the chase. Where the original version was primarily an industrial cityscape with an extended tunnel thrown in towards the end, the first phase in Remake is set at the heart of Midgar's plate, so there are numerous high-rises and office blocks around. There are two interesting things to note about the road itself. The first is that the loading screen panels in the PlayStation 4 edition of Remake confirm the Midgar Expressway is a 3-tiered superhighway that encircles the city. Part of it is still under construction and not open to the public, which is probably the intraplate connection to the slums as mentioned in Reeve's presentation at the Shinra Memorial Museum. The second highlight is that the expressway is also likely to be the one that appeared in the 2015 teaser trailer for Final Fantasy VII Remake. A neat little feature from that footage is that what we can assume is Calm is listed on an overhead sign as being 51 miles away from central Midgar. Incidentally, Junon is listed as being 133 miles away. Another cool part of all this is that the opponents faced by Cloud and Co are nowhere near random. In the original minigame, there were two types of enemies, infantrymen on golden bikes and infantrymen on red bikes. It could be argued that these are reflected in the security officers of Phase 1 and the soldier operatives of Phase 3. The latter are of particular interest, because they may be a leftover of the early plans for Remake's Chapter 18. According to Motomu Toriyama, the character Roche was due to reappear here, but his inclusion was removed because his goofy behaviour disrupted the seriousness of the scenario. Toriyama-san has made no secret of his desire to see the self-titled Speed Demon return in future, which may account for his cameo in episode Intermission, where he tells Yuffie they will next meet on the open road. Cloud also has to take out a handful of military trucks during the party's escape. This could be a callback to Before Crisis, because Shinra trucks on the Midgar Expressway feature in two separate chapters. In Chapter 10, the player Turk must drive the truck to block off pursuing avalanche motorbikes, while in Chapter 22, the player Turk is flying a helicopter and rams into an avalanche truck. The involvement of helicopters in motorbike chase sequences has also become a common theme in the compilation. In addition to the Before Crisis content, Turks Reno and Rude assist Cloud from a helicopter during his highway confrontation with Loz and Yazoo in Advent Children Complete. And then there's the small matter of G-Bike, a mobile phone game which was available in Japan between October 2014 and December 2015, where Cloud battled a variety of characters and monsters across a selection of landscapes. This, of course, was based on the Gold Saucer arcade game by the same name from the original Final Fantasy VII. As it happens, G-Bike had a Midgar Expressway level, where Cloud could take on enemies such as a rampant behemoth or guard scorpion, and he could also be challenged to a duel with Reno, who was supported by Rude from a helicopter. Believe it or not, even the Moth unit has precedent as an opponent to be fought on the expressway. In Crisis Core, when Zack is called back to Shinra HQ because the Genesis army is attacking, he encounters these autonomous weapons on the highway, albeit they are called Moth Slashers. I spoke in the final episode of my Chapter 16 breakdown about Red 13 having materia equipped to his collar when he joins the party. While there is no official confirmation of which magic orbs he has in his possession, we can guess that one of them might be healing materia. This is because he restores Cloud's health bar between phases in the easy and normal modes, though it could just be a curative item. In the original game, Red 13 joins the group with Sense and Fire materia equipped, And, speaking of fire, I was blown away by the adaptation of the motorball battle at the climax of the sequence, including the boss's infamous flamethrower mechanic. Like several other Shinra weapons I've brought up over the course of this series, the name for the robot is different in the English and Japanese versions of the game. In Japanese, it is still motorball, while in English, it has been updated to the acronym MOTOR, but there's no reference to what the letters stand for. Just as with the Valkyrie of Chapter 15, episode intermission includes a really great Easter egg, where Motor can be seen in a hangar of Scarlet's Advanced Weaponry Division during Yuffie's infiltration of it. The team defeats Motor and reaches the end of the unfinished highway, just as they do in the old game. However, rather than the five facing the dawn and making vows about a journey they are about to embark upon, the story begins to deviate. This is foreshadowed by Cloud hallucinating Sephiroth at the checkpoint, and the black feather floating to the ground, just as we saw in chapters 1 and 17 respectively. An important point to return to for a moment is that the feather represents the single black wing of Sephiroth. Specifically, the version of Sephiroth that appeared in Advent Children. While the black wing is nowadays synonymous with the villain, it doesn't actually show up in any other entry of the compilation. The wing of Safer Sephiroth in the original game is multicoloured. Before Crisis and Dirge of Cerberus do not contain reference to it, and the only black wing to appear in Crisis Core belongs to Genesis. As I've already mentioned, Remake's Chapter 18 has a huge number of callbacks and Easter eggs relating to Advent Children, and the reason for it is that the version of Sephiroth we are now about to encounter is the one from the film. This is the fourth and final variant to be seen in Remake, as confirmed in the game's initial Ultimania, where he is listed as an unknown entity. Rather than cram all the supporting evidence for that in now, I'll point some of it out as we progress through the episode. Approaching the end of the road, Cloud and the others pause as more black feathers float down from the sky. They see Sephiroth above them, slowly descending to block their path. Aerith seems to be the first to recognise that something is different about this Sephiroth, and yells that everything about him is wrong. However, a more accurate translation from the Japanese script would be that he is wrong about everything. Sephiroth goes on to say that if the world was to be unmade, so too would her children. In other words, the fate of humans is bound to that of the planet. This is a callback to Chapter 2, where Sephiroth tells Cloud that the planet is dying, and so much would be lost if it were to perish. It's also the game's way of establishing why the group might be persuaded to take actions that directly benefit Sephiroth, if it means saving humanity. The wider context for this is perhaps not obvious to many fans, and certainly not something that is explicitly conveyed in Remake's localizations. At the climax of the original Final Fantasy VII, the livestream emerges to help wholly obliterate Meteor, but the fate of the main characters is left open to interpretation. Only Red 13 is shown in the post-credits scene, set 500 years later. It was not until Advent Children that Cloud and the others were confirmed to have survived Meteorfall. When asked about this in an interview in 2005, Final Fantasy VII's director, Yoshinori Kitase, suggested that mankind was either extinct or had significantly diminished in numbers by the time of the epilogue with Red 13. This in turn implied that the planet's prosperity was correlated with humanity's decline, which is something that Bugenhagen hints at when he accompanies the party to the Forgotten Capital. The point of all this is that the planet's desired destiny, as played out in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, and which the Whispers are trying to maintain, does not actually benefit humans. Mankind will perish if either the planet dies or the flow of destiny continues on the same course. Red 13 even makes reference to this later in the chapter. Therefore, in addition to their own personal motivations, if our heroes wish to save humanity, they must alter destiny, even though this is exactly what Sephiroth wants. It's perhaps also worth clarifying here what the Sephiroth on the expressway actually is. He's not one of Cloud's hallucinations, because the others can see him. He's not one of the cloaked figures from Chapter 17, as confirmed in the Ultimanias. And he's not the real Sephiroth of this timeline, whose body is currently at the Northern Crater. He is something else, a manifestation of Sephiroth that can interact with the physical world, as will soon be witnessed when he slices through the barrier of Whispers. And where else have we seen this before? In Advent Children, with the so-called remnants Kadaj, Loz and Yazoo, who Sephiroth created from corrupted spirit energy. This corruption has been described by Tetsuya Nomura, director of both Advent Children and Final Fantasy VII Remake, as the negative lifestream, a term I will use later in the video. When Cloud threatens Sephiroth, the massive Whispers circling Shinra headquarters disperses and flies towards the end of the expressway, their cries ringing out into the night. This deafening cacophony forces the group to hold their heads as a smaller bunch of spectres dart around them, dispensing purple strands of energy to invoke a memory, just as Aerith did to Red 13 at the end of Chapter 16. The memory in question is of a soldier first class on a bluff overlooking Midgar, with a dome of Whispers surrounding the city. The Buster Sword immediately identifies the soldier as Zack Fair, the main protagonist of Crisis Core. Note how the long side of the blade is on the left, while Cloud carries it with the long side on the right. This is consistent with their respective character models in the original game and Crisis Core, as I mentioned way back in my Chapter 2 video. It's also worth pointing out that the hilt of the Buster Sword matches the way it looks in Remake's main story and the old game, rather than the gilded variant seen elsewhere in the compilation. The trailer for Crisis Core Reunion shows the gilded hilt has been abandoned for the remaster too. Anyway, we are shown a shot-for-shot reproduction of Zack's last stand from Crisis Core, with the addition of Whispers gliding among the Shinra infantrymen. Their role is to ensure events play out as ordained by the planet, but the Great Swarm around Midgar suggests something is not quite right. I'll come back to this point later. As most of us have known since the original Final Fantasy VII, Zack is fated to die here. The memory ends, not in Cloud's mind, but in Aerith's, which indicates she has been shown the same thing. Zack was an important figure in both their lives. He was a friend to Cloud and someone the young boy looked up to a great deal. And he was Aerith's first love, with the pair dating for approximately a year before he was sent on assignment to Nibelheim, never to return. We are not given the full extent of either's reaction to the memory, presumably for storytelling purposes. While part 1 of Remake has not delved too deeply into it, Cloud's current persona is a cocktail of many components, one of which is fragments of Zack's memories, character and abilities. His mind does not differentiate between Zack's existence and his own, so seeing such a memory would have been very confusing for Cloud. Aerith, on the other hand, has never been sure what happened to her former boyfriend, though the ending to Crisis Core suggests she sensed his death while she was at the Sector 5 church. Seeing the memory may therefore have provided a bit of context. Not wishing to wait any longer, Sephiroth turns and slices a hole through the circling wall of whispers. He steps into the rift and calls on Cloud to hurry after him. It is the young man's desire to make Sephiroth pay for what he did to his mother and Nibelheim, and he displays little hesitation in following the villain. However, Aerith stops him momentarily, advising that this is the point of no return, Destiny's Crossroads. In short, if they pass through the portal, they will be actively defying the planet's predetermined future. Aerith then raises an arm and unleashes a blast of energy, which very much resembles the in-battle animation of her Healing Wind limit break. This changes the rift from a violent storm to a swirl of golden particles. While the exact function of the spell is not quite clear, my friend Vesuvizad of the Cosmo Canyon Observatory has pointed out a parallel between this and how the spring at Aerith's church cures geostigma at the end of Advent Children. Similarly, the rain over Midgar cleanses the effects of the negative lifestream summoned by Sephiroth, which causes Kadaj to dissipate into spirit energy. In turn, these closely reflect the visuals and attributes of her Great Gospel limit break from the old Final Fantasy VII. When Tifa asks what the group will find beyond the portal, Aerith responds by saying boundless, terrifying freedom, and likens it to a great, never-ending sky. As discussed in my first Chapter 8 video, this is a callback to Crisis Core, where she admits to Zack that she is afraid of the sky. For Aerith, it represents the world outside Midgar, causing her to feel overwhelmed by uncertainty. The timing of this reference could not be more appropriate, given the memory of Zack that she just experienced. Aerith then turns the subject to the screams they had heard when the whispers descended upon them. She describes them as the voices of the planet, specifically the voices of those who have lived and died and returned to the livestream. This is very interesting, as it equates the whispers with the cries of the planet that are repeatedly heard during the original Final Fantasy VII, then again in Dirge of Cerberus, suggesting the spectres have been present all along. Examples of this include Bugenhagen highlighting them to the party at his observatory, Tifa's experience after she falls into the livestream with Cloud, or Reeve and Vincent hearing them aboard the Shadow Fox vehicle after Deepground's assault on Calm. Aerith eventually goes on to say that there is no greater threat to the planet than Sephiroth, and that he must be stopped. As we learned in Final Fantasy VII and Advent Children respectively, his goal is to absorb the livestream in order to become a god, then use the planet as a vessel to travel the cosmos. By absorbing the livestream, he will critically disrupt the cycle of nature, which will also lead to the demise of humanity. Aerith asks the others to fight alongside her to prevent this outcome, even if it means changing destiny. Passing through the portal, the party arrives in a place known as the Singularity, though the immediate environment is a mirror of the expressway they just left. It's not long before the calm is broken by a hurricane of whispers overhead, with the ensuing twisters ripping up the road and industrial cranes, and sucking the party into the air above this representation of Midgar. Eagle-eyed players may have spotted that every chunk of the landscape that is drawn skyward is accompanied by a green or purple strand, indicating they are part of a collection of memories. Motomu Toriyama infers in the Material Ultimania Plus that the Singularity exists outside the construct of linear time. This concept is worth keeping in mind, because the implication is that changes occurring in the Singularity can have consequences at different points in time in the real world. We've seen this already in the chapter, with the Dome of Whispers appearing around Midgar in the past, during Zack's last stand. Furthermore, scenario writer Kazushige Najima revealed in an interview in the first remake Ultimania that there is no predetermined fate in the Singularity, so the Whispers have little to no control here. In physics terms, a singularity is the point which something takes an infinite value. In the context of space and time, it relates to matter being infinitely dense, such as at the centre of a black hole. If we apply this principle to Final Fantasy VII Remake, the singularity might be described as the core of the planet's cycle of time and space, or, to use the game's wording, the core of its destiny. This is not to be confused with the lifestream, which is the planet's cycle of energy. The mere existence of the singularity may be too abstract or too uncomfortable an idea for some fans, but this is by no means the first time the player character has been taken to a different dimension. It's possible to argue that the scenario in the old game that takes place inside the lifestream, where Tifa helps to repair Cloud's fractured psyche, is another dimension, but it could alternatively be called a spiritual plane. However, there is precedent elsewhere in the compilation. Examples include Zack being pulled into Ifrit and Bahamut's domains after Genesis summons them in Crisis Core, the player Turks entering Zirconiad's dimension at the climax of Before Crisis, or Vincent battling Nero the Sable amid his darkness during Dirge of Cerberus. Cloud regains consciousness somewhere high above Midgar, and soon finds himself confronted by a colossal monster comprised of a twisted black exterior and a brain and heart of glowing purple. We'll come back to the purple elements later in the episode, but this is a colour that has been discussed several times already over the course of the video series. The entity is a Whisper Harbinger, described in the enemy intel as an accretion or accumulation of whispers that materialises when someone tries to alter the course of destiny. The material Ultimania adds to this by verifying that it has greater control over the flow of destiny than the standard arbiters, though perhaps not in the singularity itself, as per Najima-san's earlier comments. It is said these Harbingers are connected to all the threads of time and space that shape the planet's fate. This reinforces what I've already spoken about, with regards to the singularity existing beyond the construct of linear time. Depending on your interpretation, the threads of time and space could refer to multiple points and locations on a single timeline, or it could allude to the possibility of multiple timelines. More on that later. During the introduction of the Whisper Harbinger, it gathers a vortex of debris to its arm by casting what seems to be a huge gravity spell. As has always been the case with Final Fantasy VII, the visual representation of gravity magic is a black hole, which ties in nicely with the physics terminology regarding a singularity. Cloud dodges the debris hurled towards him by the Harbinger by leaping and diving through the air, then slashing through large chunks of rock. This is conveniently reminiscent of his battle with Sephiroth towards the end of Advent Children. If I didn't know any better, I'd suggest the game's developers were trying to plant a little seed in the players' minds. And while we're back on the subject of Advent Children, what happens when Cloud meets up with Barret and Tifa takes things to a whole new level. The Harbinger sends 3 distinct whispers to engage the party in battle, and, as they materialise around the group, we see one has a large gauntlet-like appendage, one has 2 gun-like arms, and the third has what appears to be a sword. These are Whispers Viridi, Croceo and Rubrum, respectively, whose names mean green, amber and red in Latin. Assessing these fiends or accessing their enemy intel bios will reveal that they are entities from a future timeline that have manifested in the present to protect the future that gave shape to them. In other words, if our heroes are successful in changing the course of destiny, these beings will not come into existence. For a while after Remake's release in 2020, many fans, myself included, speculated that Rubrum, Viridi and Croceo are future versions of Cloud, Tifa and Barret, trying to protect the timeline of the original Final Fantasy VII. However, there were a few inconsistencies in that theory. It was only when the initial remake Ultimania was published that the developers confirmed they are in fact manifestations of Kadaj, Loz and Yazoo, Sephiroth's remnants from Advent Children. In terms of the weapons the Whispers are armed with, this makes a lot more sense, because Kadaj's double-bladed katana, Suba, is reflected in Rubrum's sword, Loz's mechanical fist, Dual Hound, is reflected in Viridi's gauntlet, and Yazoo's twin pistols, the Velvet Nightmare, are reflected in Croceo's guns. The latter is of particular interest, as Croceo's attack Amber Judgment is actually called Velvet Nightmare in the Japanese version of Remake. Thank you to Audrey on Twitter at Itakemochi for highlighting the translation. I'd also like to give another shout out to Viz at the Cosmo Canyon Observatory for pointing out that Viridi uses a move called Elude, or Back Crusher in Japanese, which mimics Loz's knockout blow to Tifa during their duel at the church in Advent Children. The material Ultimania even confirms a unique camera angle was implemented to emphasise this. Another major reference to the film is the later summoning by the Arbiters of Whisper Bahamut. This reflects Kadaj's summoning of Bahamut Sin, also known as Bahamut Tremor, to destroy the Meteor Fall monument in Edge, only to be fought and conquered by Cloud and the others. Admittedly, there were a couple of clues hidden in plain sight regarding the identities of the Whispers. Perhaps the most obvious was the name of the music track that plays for most of this section of the game, Arbiter of Fate Advent. In Christian theology, Advent often refers to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Use of the word in Advent Children is typically interpreted to reflect the film's plot concerning the return of Sephiroth. Could it be that Remake is using it the same way? We'll find out soon enough. After a few skirmishes with the Whispers and navigating the floating ruins of the Midgar Expressway, which, as I mentioned earlier in the video, also features in Advent Children, Cloud, Barret and Tifa face off against Rubrum on his own. They are successful in defeating the Arbiter, with the damage being amplified on the giant Whisper Harbinger, causing one of its arms to detach. Streams of memory strands are released from the severed limb, which implies that the glowing currents within the Harbinger are part of the lifestream. As I've mentioned a few times already in the series, memory strands and spirit energy are interchangeable on a loose basis in Final Fantasy VII. A lot of focus is placed on Rubrum, Viridi and Croceo during this sequence, and how engaging them precedes the arrival of Sephiroth, just as the conflict with Kadaj, Loz and Yazoo does in Advent Children. What may be less obvious is that a second parallel exists. In the original Final Fantasy VII, the final battle is fought against Safer Sephiroth, but this is preceded by Bizarro Sephiroth. Bizarro is a monstrous form comprised of 5 potential targets. These are the head, the main body, the core, the left limb, called the left magic, and the right limb, called the right magic. The player can attack Bizarro strategically to disable its spell-casting limbs, as well as its core and head. The Whisper Harbinger's main components are very similar to these, with the latter two perhaps being equated with its glowing brain and heart. And where Bizarro's left and right limbs are generally quick to be resurrected by its core, the Harbinger's arms are soon reformed by the Whispers. The most telling piece of evidence to support the comparison though may yet again be the music track that plays when the Harbinger loses its limb. Arbiter of Fate, Rebirth. What many fans in the West may not be aware of is that Bizarro's name in the Japanese original is actually Rebirth Sephiroth. This is what the famous soundtrack accompaniment, Birth of a God, derives from. And with the recent title reveal for the next remake installment being Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, this may have been a little teaser all along. Just as Aerith and Red 13 catch up to the others, a flood of memory strands shoots forth from the Harbinger's severed arm. The group are shown a vision of the 500 years later epilogue from Final Fantasy VII, or, more specifically, they see the recreation of the scene that was used as the prologue in Advent Children. When the memory ends, Barrett asks what it was they just witnessed. Red 13 replies that it was a glimpse of the future, should they fail in changing destiny. Again, this very likely relates to Yoshinori Kitase's comments in 2005 that humanity may be extinct within 500 years, though it's not made clear in the game. Something similar occurs when Cloud, Barrett and Red 13 defeat Whisper's Viridi and Krokeo to expose the Harbinger's glowing purple heart. Then again when all three coloured arbiters are exterminated. The party is sequentially shown memories of Meteor approaching the planet, Cloud's final duel with Sephiroth in the old game, the holy materia falling from the water altar at the Forgotten Capital, and finally, Cloud laying Aerith's body to rest in the lake. These images further fuel the characters' personal motivations to avoid the destiny of the original Compilation's timeline. They also very handily all show up in the prologue and introduction to Advent Children. In a couple of blink and you miss it moments, during the last phase of the battle, the camera will switch to Barrett and Red 13 using their limit breaks, each time one of the three arbiters is defeated. The names of the limit breaks appear on screen. Barrett unleashes his Fire in the Hole attack, or Big Shot to those of us familiar with the old game, while Red 13 uses Stardust Ray, another limit from the original, which is supposed to cause stars to rain down on the enemy. I guess Remake's developers didn't have time to include the animation here. Upon the defeat of the Whisper Harbinger, the group finds itself engulfed in light, standing atop a pool of shallow water, with swirling gusts of white that gradually calm. Cloud asks where they are, but Aerith gives him a non-committed answer. We've actually seen similar locations before in the compilation. There are two examples from Advent Children, where Aerith speaks to Cloud from the afterlife and they meet in a meadow of yellow flowers. Then again when Cloud is on the brink of death, floating in a white space before he wakes in the healing spring at the Sector 5 church. Perhaps an even closer comparison can be found at the start of Chapter 10 in Crisis Core, when Zack watches a white feather descend onto a pool reflecting the azure sky, though his physical body is still inside a Mako capsule at Shinra Manor. In each of these three examples, there is some connection to the livestream or spirit plane. The same is true here, but it would appear the defeat of the Whisper Harbinger has somehow engulfed the group in a specific memory. It might not be clear at first, but lead effects artist Yoichi Iwata reveals in the Material Ultimania that this scene depicts the clash between the livestream and Meteor. As we know from the ending of the original Final Fantasy VII, this clash does not occur until Holy has tried and failed to stop Meteor's descent on Midgar. The bright light and swirling gusts of white all around the party in this moment indicates they are inside the memory of Holy's summoning. Cloud suddenly hears Sephiroth's voice in his mind. The white backdrop rapidly turns a threatening shade of crimson, and they watch in alarm as Meteor's crust bears down on them. A scene that veteran fans will likely recognise as wholly failing. The enormous fiery comet looms low in the sky above them, causing twisters to tear the ground apart. At the centre of it all is the same glowing purple form as could be seen at the heart of the Whisper Harbinger, held in place by chains of black. As the purple and the shackles begin to evaporate, Cloud realises it is Sephiroth. So what does all this mean? To briefly summarise, I have spoken repeatedly over the course of this series about the colour purple, and how its recurring appearances relate to the presence or influence of Sephiroth. And not just any Sephiroth, but this version of Sephiroth, the one that has been imprisoned in the Singularity, the version that Cloud and the others had not encountered prior to reaching the end of the Midgar Expressway. This is confirmed in the initial remake Ultimania, as translated by Audrey. So, who is this Sephiroth? Well, based on the original compilation, Sephiroth's real body is currently regenerating at the Northern Crater. Remake's Ultimania advises that we have never met this Sephiroth before, which is only half true. He is new to the players and characters of Remake, but not to the wider audience of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII. As I highlighted earlier, it is absolutely deliberate that Chapter 18 is packed full of Advent Children allusions, or that the imagery surrounding this Sephiroth leans so heavily on his iconic black wing and feathers. This is the version of Sephiroth that was defeated by Cloud at the end of the movie, and banished once again from the physical world. It would seem he was subsequently confined by the planet in the Singularity, a place that exists, as I've already mentioned, beyond the construct of linear time. From here, Sephiroth has been able to influence Cloud and the events of Remake through means such as the purple-shaded enigmatic spectres fought in chapters 4 and 12. To truly understand who and what Sephiroth is at this particular moment, we must refer to the official novella On the Way to a Smile, authored by Kazushige Najima, the lead scenario writer for most of the compilation and remake. On the Way to a Smile is set in the 2-year period between Final Fantasy VII and Advent Children, and contains a series of mini-chapters called Lifestream Black and Lifestream White. These are told from the perspectives of Sephiroth and Aerith respectively, both of whom are in the Afterlife's cycle of souls. Sephiroth's mini-chapters describe how he refuses to allow the core of his spirit energy to dissolve into the lifestream, and so makes Cloud the nucleus of his existence. As long as Cloud remembers him, he cannot fade, which is why Sephiroth cultivates the young man's hatred of him. Hang on to that hatred, to quote Sephiroth from Remake's Chapter 2. On the Way to a Smile goes on to reveal that the villain relinquished all his memories that no longer had any meaning, those of his childhood or handful of friends, etc. Anything from before he knew his destiny as the son of Genova. Those memories joined the livestream and became part of the swell that destroyed Meteor, the specific future event the party is currently witnessing. In the aftermath of Meteor Fall, as the world slowly returns to normal, Sephiroth begins to leave traces of himself on those affected by Geostigma. Their spirit energy returns to the planet, but the despair that had filled their hearts makes it vulnerable to his influence. This dark, corrupted collection of spirit energy, of angry or sorrowful memories, is what becomes the so-called negative lifestream. In Advent Children, when Sephiroth talks about choking and corroding the planet so that he may use it as his vessel to travel the cosmos, his control of the negative lifestream is what he is referencing. Eventually, Sephiroth attempts to send his spirit to walk the surface of the planet, but discovers he is unable to do so because the livestream has consumed his memories of himself, and thus his identity. Instead, he binds his consciousness to the memory he finds of a boy, using this to manifest Kadaj, and later Loz and Yazoo. As a side note, the novel The Kids Are Alright confirms that this boy did once exist, and was a friend of Kirei Kanan's, but he died in a fire. So, in conclusion, the version of Sephiroth encountered in the Singularity is his post-Advent Children form. He continues to lack a body, and projecting himself into the real world is a challenge, because A, he is imprisoned by the planet, and B, the memories of his past and self-identity were lost in the livestream. However, all that is about to change. Before I move on, I just want to give another massive thank you to my good friend and YouTube essayist Sleepeasy, whose own breakdown of this subject helped refine my understanding. It has been a genuine privilege throughout this journey to stand shoulder to shoulder with some of the best analytical minds in the Final Fantasy VII community, such as Sleepeasy, Schrodinger's Baby Seal, Vesuvizarth, Shidemp, and others, and I am eternally grateful for their support. Anyway, as Sephiroth's bindings begin to fade, streams of black energy rush across the surface of Meteor, and down to where he is suspended. With each passing moment, it becomes clear that the streams being absorbed are none other than the memory of Meteor at the point of its destruction, something that may previously have been guarded by the Whisper Harbinger. Given that the livestream itself is just a great collection of memories and experiences, we can deduce that the black streams through which Sephiroth absorbs the memory of Meteor is the negative livestream. This is an extremely important detail, because Sephiroth has now reversed the actions he took during On the Way to a Smile, where his personal memories had been discarded, merging with the livestream before it destroyed Meteor. By absorbing the livestream's memory of Meteor, he has additionally restored his own memories and thus his former identity. This time around, however, he is also armed with future knowledge of the original game and compilation. It should also be noted that absorbing the livestream is exactly what Sephiroth says he intends to do, by causing a terrible wound on the planet. When the vision of Meteor has disappeared, all that remains is Sephiroth hovering in the air below gathering clouds. The image is very reminiscent of the scene in Advent Children, where Kadaj merges with Genova cells so that Sephiroth can materialise in the physical world. Similarly, the debris and ruined buildings around him now belong to Shinra headquarters, which is where Cloud and Sephiroth's battle takes place in the movie. And if this wasn't evidence enough, the planning materials section of the Material Ultimania outright calls the first phase of this encounter a recreation of the Advent Children duel. The fight itself is an absolute spectacle, a joy to behold and participate in. It is an amalgamation of all the Sephiroth battles that have come before. The setting of Advent Children, the real-time one-to-one combat of Crisis Core, at least to begin with, and the high world-changing stakes of the original Safer Sephiroth. Interestingly, the rearrangement of his iconic theme music, One-Winged Angel, is a literal rearrangement, with the phases of the song playing in a different order than what we are used to. Could this be a reference to the events in the Singularity being a rearrangement of Destiny? Well, the title of the track is actually One-Winged Angel Rebirth, which ties in very nicely with the name of Remake's sequel, where this altered destiny will play out. Many of Sephiroth's past abilities make a return, such as Shadow Flare, a dark spell used by Sephiroth, Octoslash, his Limit Break in Crisis Core, Heartless Angel, which reduces all characters' HP to 1 and is used by Bizarro Sephiroth in addition to the 2 incarnations already mentioned, Firaga, Blizzaga and Thundaga, also known as Fire 3, Ice 3 and Bolt 3, which Sephiroth uses in battle during the Nibelheim flashback. And let's not overlook his move Hell's Gate, a downward lunge with the Masamune, which may be a reflection of the murder of Aerith. As I touched on in the previous video, Sephiroth's name is derived from the Sephiroth of Jewish Kabbalist mysticism. There have always been the themes of death and the divine in words associated with him, such as One-Winged Angel, Birth of a God, or Pale Horse, which is a reference to Death's steed in the Christian book of Revelations. The themes are continued in Remake, with Sephiroth using attacks such as Divine Proclamation, Boundless Void, and Wave of Nihility. He even shows off his sadistic side by taunting Cloud with the line, "Oh, the memories," when he switches his elemental alignment to fire mid-fight. This of course is an allusion to him burning down Nibelheim. And speaking of allusions, Sephiroth quotes his famous line from Advent Children, "Shall I give you the spare?" when he performs Heartless Angel. Towards the end of the battle, Sephiroth will summon Meteor overhead once more, triggering a countdown that will result in a game over if it reaches 0 and the fiery giant strikes. It's possible this is a callback to the supernova attack of Safer Sephiroth, where a comet hurtled through space then decimated the planet by colliding with the sun. Once enough damage has been dealt to Sephiroth, the single black wing bursts from his right shoulder. As previously discussed, this pretty much verifies that the Sephiroth we are fighting is the one vanquished by Cloud in Advent Children. The wing's emergence causes an eruption of grey strands around it, the texture of which is very similar to that seen in the Whispers over the course of Remake. He also later summons them to his outstretched hand, just as he does with the negative livestream in Advent Children. In case there was any confusion, the planning materials section of the Material Ultimania confirms the Whispers have already merged with Sephiroth, presumably during his absorption of the Meteor memory, and presumably the same ones that had accumulated to form the Harbinger. When Sephiroth is defeated, he unleashes a number of these Whispers at the party, but they drive the Spectres back. Aerith motivates them by shouting that they can make things right, further implying that the 500 years later epilogue from the original is the wrong outcome. As the others fend off the Whisper assault, Cloud takes off after Sephiroth. Darting up the debris, he leaps high into the air, bringing the Buster Sword down on his smirking nemesis. While it's not clear in real time, slowing the footage allows us to see that Cloud slices through a host of spectres. The strike results in an explosion of purple and white, the two primary colours of Safer Sephiroth's realm. The implication here is that by absorbing the Whispers and embracing Cloud's concentrated onslaught, Sephiroth has guaranteed the Arbiter's eradication, with consequences more far-reaching than we could have imagined. Cloud finds himself careering through a wormhole, exactly as his subconscious did at the end of the original Final Fantasy VII following the defeat of Safer Sephiroth. The crucial thing to remember here is that, again, just as in the old game, this entire scene is taking place in the livestream, specifically the memory of a future that has not yet come to pass. In the English localization, this is called the Edge of Creation. However, when asked to describe what it actually is, in the remake's Material Ultimania Plus, Motomu Toriyama said that it is the end of the world, a place where time has stopped, 7 seconds before the destruction of the planet. Keep this in mind as I discuss the exchange between Cloud and Sephiroth. Rather than immediately engage Sephiroth in battle, as he does in the original, Cloud drops from the wormhole and has one of his mental jolts. Sephiroth gently takes his hand and reminds him that the future he is envisioning does not yet exist. In essence, Sephiroth knows that the defeat of the Whispers in the Singularity means that events predetermined in the old Final Fantasy VII are no longer certain to be fulfilled. Gazing towards the cosmos, Sephiroth tells Cloud that their world will become part of it one day. This is interesting because it not only harks back to Advent Children and the silver-haired villain's plan to use this planet as a vessel to travel through space, but it addresses the display in Dirge of Cerberus, where Shulk projects Lucrezia's thesis to Vincent and the others, highlighting that the Omega weapon's function is to gather the planet's lifestream and return it to the wider universe. It is not beyond the realms of possibility that utilising Omega in this way is Sephiroth's endgame for the Remake project. After all, Vincent's future obliteration of Omega all but traps Sephiroth and Jenova on this planet. Thanks once again to Sleep Easy for first bringing the theory to my attention. While it's difficult to make out during Remake itself, the Material Ultimania confirms that the multicoloured nebula was designed to reflect the wing of Safer Sephiroth. There is no such clarity provided for the red nebula behind Cloud, though one just like it does briefly appear in the attack animation for Safer Sephiroth's supernova. My interpretation of this is that they represent two outcomes from a decision, or series of decisions, Cloud will have to make, but we'll come back to this in a minute. Sephiroth goes on to ask Cloud to lend him his strength, so that they may defy destiny together. This is an unusual display of respect, though his agenda is ambiguous. Sephiroth's current existence remains reliant on Cloud's memories and hatred of him, hence his refusal to let Cloud end. But it's clear he considers their goals to be aligned at this moment. I guess any change to a timeline in which he has been defeated would be beneficial to Sephiroth. Cloud rejects Sephiroth's proposal and they have a standoff, with the visuals recreating their final duel at the end of Final Fantasy VII. The young man unleashes a barrage of attacks that vaguely resemble Omnislash, the limit break he uses to finish Sephiroth off in the last fight, whether the player obtained it during the story or not. The difference here is that the legendary swordsman dodges and blocks Cloud's strikes with ease, eventually knocking his blade away. The sword embeds itself in the ground, an image that mirrors Remake's title screen. When Sephiroth says not yet, it implies once again that he is aware of the counterpart duel in the original game. Sephiroth then whispers in Cloud's ear that this is 7 seconds from the end, which, as I mentioned, has been confirmed to mean 7 seconds from the planet's destruction, and says there is enough time left for Cloud to change the outcome. While this has been interpreted by many to mean that Cloud will be faced with an impossible choice in the seconds preceding the planet's future annihilation, I personally think it means that Cloud's choices over the course of the Remake trilogy will determine the fate of all. Motomu Toriyama's comments in the Material Ultimania Plus that some kind of power could be used to alter the path of time and space leaves a lot open to speculation. Another big shout out to the Cosmo Canyon Observatory for providing the context of the Japanese script for this part of Cloud and Sephiroth's exchange. It's also worth pointing out that the music playing for the duration of this scene is called 7 Seconds Till the End, which is a new version of Listen to the Cries of the Planet, the track from the original game's forgotten capital. The City of the Ancients represents the loss of an entire civilization, and is the place where Aerith dies, so this may be a bit of foreshadowing to Sephiroth challenging Cloud to make the right decisions to save the world. An alternative interpretation could be that this scene immediately follows the supposed defeat of the Whispers, who were revealed earlier in Chapter 18 to be the cries of the planet themselves. One last thing to highlight here from a lore perspective is Sephiroth's usage of pronouns in the Japanese edition of Remake. At the edge of creation, Sephiroth refers to himself by Ore rather than Watashi, the latter of which he uses for most of Final Fantasy VII and Advent Children. In Crisis Core, he uses Ore exclusively. This implies that how Sephiroth identified himself before being thrown into the livestream by Cloud at Nibelheim is different to how he identified himself afterwards. As I spoke of earlier, On the Way to a Smile reveals that Sephiroth cast away his unnecessary memories while in the livestream, only to have them restored when he absorbed the memory of Meteor in Remake. Returning to the self-identifier Ore strongly supports this. Additionally, Ore is a far less formal pronoun than Watashi, implying that his character has changed and/or he feels a significant degree of familiarity with Cloud. The ending of Final Fantasy VII Remake is comprised of a handful of scenes showing what many of the key players are up to. The first of these takes place in the presidential office at Shinra headquarters. Rufus is staring out at the helipad when Heidegger arrives and addresses him as Mr. Vice President. Rufus ignores him, but does respond to Sung, who calls him Mr. President. This is both to show that Rufus expects to be recognised as the new Shinra leader, and to lay the foundations of the prickly relationship between him and Heidegger that is seen throughout the old game. The executive directors line up in front of his desk, but there is a notable absence: Hojo. The professor is subsequently shown at the drum, standing before the Genova tank and cackling. As discussed in my second Chapter 17 video, his delight relates to his reunion theory coming to fruition. It should also be noted that Hojo resigns from Shinra and disappears, following the corresponding events in Final Fantasy VII. I for one can't wait to see him on the Costa del Sol beach with his lab coat on. I'll come back to the Zack scene shortly, but for now I want to talk about the Dome of Whispers we saw earlier in Chapter 18, circling Midgard during Zack's last stand. The same dome has exploded into particles of golden light, floating to the ground around Zack and also onto the survivors of the Sector 7 plate collapse. What's curious about this is that these two events occur approximately 10 weeks apart, according to the official timeline. In essence, the golden particles represent the eradication of the Whispers. Their defeat in the Singularity, which is connected to all threads of time and space, means this eradication occurs simultaneously at all locations, past, present and future. And what does this mean? Well, every intervention the Whispers have ever made to maintain the planet's preferred destiny has now been removed. In short, key events of the past have changed, and the future, as Aerith says, is now a blank slate. This is evidenced in very subtle ways, such as the broken 7th Heaven signage being cleaved differently to how it was in Chapter 13, or in blatant ways, such as Biggs' survival. Biggs, Wedge and Jessie of course all perished in the original game when the Sector 7 plate fell, so this is one of a few significant deviations at the end of Remake. You can also see Jessie's glove and headband on the desk beside Biggs, implying that she too may have been saved. Biggs is asleep at the Leaf House, the orphanage in which he grew up and latterly taught at, as confirmed in the official novel Traces of Two Pasts. However, when asked about this exact matter, co-director Toriyama-san remarked that an important theme of this story is loss, suggesting that certain scenes would be less impactful if death was not permanent. This is also a callback to one of the original Final Fantasy VII's core themes, how a person's death can affect those left behind, which was introduced by Final Fantasy's legendary creator Hironobu Sakaguchi following the passing of his mother. That said, Toriyama-san does go on to comment that if any characters have survived, they have likely done so in a different world. This is deliberately vague, because that could allude to either the livestream or an altered timeline. I should also highlight that Midgar being showered by these golden particles is by no means the first time such a visual has been used in the compilation. Something similar happens in Before Crisis and Dirge of Cerberus, following the respective defeats of the Zirconiad summon and the Omega weapon, with the latter also including the uncertain future of a character, Shalua Rui. The healing rainwater at the end of Advent Children is another example. And speaking of Advent Children, the scene switches to Marlene in the bedroom at Elmira's house. As she goes to run downstairs, a drop of water tumbles from a flower leaf, causing her to pause as if she heard Barrett's voice. This is a direct callback to the film, where Marlene senses Aerith's presence when the rain begins to fall on Edge. Communication via water on a spiritual level is something that has been present in the compilation for a while, and there is evidence to show Marlene in particular is sensitive to it, just like Aerith, who senses Zack's fatal injuries at the end of Crisis Core. The optional scene at the conclusion of Remake's Chapter 8 also introduces the concept of the language of the flowers, so hearing Barrett's voice may have been amplified through them. Barrett and the others, of course, have exited the Singularity and are now in the wastelands outside Midgar. We see Cloud holding a black feather, which slowly evaporates. This is to remind us that Sephiroth's essence remains in the livestream, and he is still a threat. The party then discusses pursuing Sephiroth to beat him, which is reminiscent of their conversation at the end of the expressway in the original game. Even Red 13 commits to the hunt, which differs slightly from before, because he previously only agreed to travel as far as Cosmo Canyon. One of the most controversial elements of Remake's ending sequence has been Zack surviving the onslaught of the Shinra army. We were shown the standoff earlier in Chapter 18, a close recreation of Crisis Core's cutscene, only with the addition of the Whispers gliding amongst the infantrymen. With their eradication across time, the Arbiters are no longer able to ensure Zack's death in this battle, which is supposed to be the catalyst for Cloud becoming the hero of the story. Now, something major has changed. This is best depicted in the stamp crisp bag that blows past the screen. Remake has made a big deal about the popular cartoon and Shinra mascot, with Tetsuya Nomura revealing in an Ultimania interview that Stamp is an important character, who he personally illustrated. However, the breed of the dog has changed from a beagle to a Yorkshire Terrier, something that scenario writer Kazushige Nojima emphasised in the same interview. I've hinted at this a few times over the course of the video series, but as my friend and fellow content creator Sector 6 Gaming pointed out, the new stamp image could not simply have been amended at the time of Zack's last stand. In other words, something significant has also changed further back in history, altering the design of the mascot that was used for Shinra propaganda during the Wutai War. Who or what Stamp represents has not yet been revealed, and there are many theories out there, including my own that I shared earlier in the series, or that it's a play on Zack the puppy, Angeal's nickname for Zack in Crisis Core. What seems clear, however, is that the breed of stamp we will encounter in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and other future titles will tell us which story continuity we are dealing with, whether this is in the form of a single altered timeline, multiple overlapping timelines, the space between the physical world and the livestream, or something else entirely, remains to be seen. As the party prepares to depart Midgar, rain begins to fall from the sky. We are shown a vision of Zack passing this spot a few weeks earlier, carrying Cloud with him towards the city, which is something Aerith picks up on. This is the reverse of her sensing him dying in the wastelands at the end of Crisis Core, also through contact with rain. On Zack's side, the rain is clearing, and the sun is emerging from the clouds above Midgar. This also reflects the weather during Cloud's final approach in Crisis Core, after he has taken up Zack's sword to be his living legacy. While on the topic of the Great Blade, many fans have asked the question, are there now two Buster Swords? One from the Remake events, in the possession of Cloud, and the other from the post-Singularity events, in the possession of Zack. The same would apply to the potential of multiple Clouds, if this is a single timeline. Watamu Toriyama's comment on this in the secret section of the first remake Ultimania was that we should not expect the two Clouds to occupy the same time and space. I interpret this to mean that neither Cloud nor any other character will ever encounter another version of themselves. And for anyone wondering why Cloud's outfit has changed in the Zack ending scene, this once again relates to Crisis Core. In that game, before the pair escaped Shinra Manor at Nibelheim, Zack dressed Cloud in one of his old soldier uniforms. How Cloud came to acquire his spiked pauldron and bracelets by the time of Final Fantasy VII is still a mystery. In the present, Aerith looks to the heavens and says that she misses the steel sky, meaning the underside of Midgar's plate. As I touched on earlier in the episode, the sky beyond Midgar fills her with uncertainty. This is a reference to Aerith having no idea what the future holds, now that the party has overcome destiny in the Singularity. However, it's also a meta-commentary on how the players should be feeling. The journey the group is about to embark upon for the remainder of this trilogy is unknown. With the release of the PlayStation 5 version of the game, called Remake Intergrade, came an extension to the ending. One part of this features Zack outside the Sector 5 church, psyching himself up to see Aerith again for the first time in 5 years. The pair spend a lot of time here together during Crisis Core, so it would be fitting for their reunion to take place here. However, when Zack bursts inside, he finds a number of people around the inside of the nave, weeping and comforting one another. Aerith is not present, and the music playing in the background creates an ominous mood, as if something terrible has happened to her. This is yet more evidence of a changed timeline, as is the ambiguous amendment of the religious symbol behind the altar from stone to wood. It's unclear if this is deliberate or a production oversight. The key takeaway from this scene is that so much of it is a direct contrast to the end of Advent Children. In the film, Cloud banishes Sephiroth and awakens in the church to find joyous children and the people of Edge celebrating, then sees the spirits of Zack and Aerith against a doorway framed in white light. In this scene, following the return of Sephiroth, Zack arrives through the doorway of white light to discover Aerith missing and the denizens of the slums grieving. Given that Chapter 18 contains reference to so many story beats from Advent Children overall, this ties in pretty well. What does it all mean though? Only time will tell. And that concludes my breakdown of Final Fantasy VII Remake. There are so many mysteries yet to be unravelled in the next instalment, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and beyond, with Zack's own story being revisited in Crisis Core Reunion. It has been clear for some time that the Remake project is taking the story in a new or varied direction. The teaser trailer for Rebirth that dropped in June 2022 for the 25th anniversary celebrations seems to have reinforced that. The question is not whether there will be changes, the question is what the degree of those changes will be. Rebirth itself has been in development since before the first instalment released in 2020, so the creative team already knew where things were headed by the time of their interviews in the Remake Ultimania. I will personally embrace whatever changes come our way in Rebirth, but I believe producer Yoshinori Kitase when he says that the team have strong feelings about not straying too far from the original story, and lead writer Kazushige Najima when he says he has created scenarios that follow the general flow of Final Fantasy VII. It is the way things will be presented or how events might occur that will be slightly different. Wataru Toriyama likened the extent of these changes to the wall market scenario in Remake, where they delivered something that was simultaneously very familiar and very different. I for one cannot wait to see what this new future holds for Final Fantasy VII. Well guys, this has been my recap of the compilation lore and Easter eggs from Chapter 18. I hope you enjoyed it, and please be sure to leave a comment with any feedback or something you think I've missed. If you haven't already done so, I invite you to check out my Patreon account, where you'll find free downloads of my unofficial novelisation of Final Fantasy VII, the Nibelheim incident, and so much more. Subscribers also get access to a huge amount of original content as well, including project artwork or mythology and Final Fantasy articles, etc. And please consider picking up a copy of my book, Norse Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, which is now also available as an audiobook and special edition hardback. The links to each edition can be found on my Patreon, the address for which is noted at the end of this video. And keep an eye out for my follow-up title, Greek Myths That Inspired Final Fantasy VII, releasing later this year. I would again like to thank KupoCon for commissioning the series, which can be viewed in full via their YouTube playlist, and I'd encourage all viewers to support their channel and brand. But for now, take care. I'm MJ Gallagher. Thank you for watching.